At 12:36 a.m., the emergency operator heard a woman struggling to stay calm. Her words were precise, almost rehearsed, as if she knew time was limited. "My ex is trying to kill me," she said. "He's stealing my money." There was no screaming, no chaos, just fear, control, and urgent. Then, without warning, the call went silent. 89 seconds. That was all she had. Later, security cameras would capture a brief flash from a nearby balcony. Investigators would say it was the moment her last chance for help was taken away. Think about what a single action from you really means. One subscribe doesn't just support this channel. It adds one more voice standing up against domestic violence. One like isn't just the algorithm. It's a show of support for every woman silently enduring abuse. And one comment is a message that says, "You're not alone." This video isn't just Tatiana's story. It's a warning. If we stay silent today, tomorrow this will happen in your home, to your mother, your sister, or your wife. If you want a world where no man even thinks of harming his wife, if you want women to be respected as humans, not objects, then share this video as widely as possible. Subscribe to The Case Point, like the video, and leave a comment to add your voice, so this story and the fight against domestic violence is never silenced. The night Tatiana Dokhotaru died did not begin with violence. There were no raised voices echoing through the building, no frantic calls from neighbors, no warning signs that would have drawn attention from the outside. It was late May 2023 in Liverpool, a quiet suburb in Western Sydney. The apartment complex had settled into its usual rhythm. Lights dimmed, televisions murmuring behind closed doors, cars parked and unmoving. By all outward appearances, it was just another ordinary night. Inside her apartment, Tatiana was alone. At least, she believed she was supposed to be. The relationship with Danny Zayed had ended. That much was clear. Messages between them showed finality, not reconciliation. She had moved on, or was trying to. The apartment was meant to be a place of separation, a physical boundary between her past and whatever came next. But that boundary did not hold. Investigators would later determine that Zayed arrived uninvited. There was no evidence of a planned visit, no mutual agreement. His presence that night was not accidental, and it was not welcome. What happened next did not unfold suddenly. It built slowly in the way domestic confrontations often do. A conversation that turned tense, words that carried history, accusations shaped by jealousy and resentment. Zayed had not come to talk things through. He had come to confront and to reclaim control. Tatiana kept cash in the apartment, money she earned through a small business she ran independently. It was stored carefully, deliberately, in a distinctive shoebox. That detail would later become important. At some point during the night, the argument shifted from emotional to practical, from the relationship to the money. This was no longer about closure. It was about possession. Despite the tension, there was still a moment when Tatiana believed she could manage the situation. That belief is crucial. People don't call emergency services at the first sign of discomfort. They call when they realize something has crossed a line. Before that call, there was hesitation. There was hope that the confrontation would end without harm, that Zayed would leave, that the night would return to normal. But as the minutes passed, it became clear he wasn't leaving. The ordinary night, the quiet, predictable routine of the building, masked what was unfolding behind one door. No one outside could hear the shift from argument to danger. No one knew that the situation was collapsing in real time. And by the time Tatiana reached for her phone, the night was no longer ordinary. It was already too late. Tatiana Dokhotaru was not defined by the way her life ended. To understand this case, investigators first had to understand her, who she was before fear entered the picture. She was 34 years old, disciplined, focused, raised by a mother who believed deeply in structure, independence, and resilience. From a young age, Tatiana was taught that nothing came without effort. Those around her describe her as someone who didn't wait for opportunities. She created them. Tennis was one of her early passions, not just as a sport, but as a discipline. It demanded control, patience, and mental strength, traits that would follow her into adulthood. When she later moved across continents, it wasn't impulsive. It was calculated. Australia represented possibility, a place where she could build something of her own. Tatiana did exactly that. She ran a small business, working long hours, managing risk, and handling her finances independently. She was careful with money, practical, and self-reliant. The cash she kept wasn't reckless. It was a result of work, effort, survival. To her family, Tatiana was known for her courage. Her stepfather, Dennis Stephen, would later tell the court that her mother, Tatiana Dokhotaru, raised her to be extraordinary. That word mattered. It wasn't praise. It was expectation. Tatiana was raised to endure, to push forward, to handle problems herself. But endurance can become a weakness when it keeps someone silent. By 2022, something had changed. When Tatiana visited her family in Canada, they noticed it immediately. The energy was gone. The confidence dulled. The woman who had left for Australia with ambition and excitement now carried visible fear. She asked a question that caught them off guard. Could she stay? Not for a visit. Not temporarily. Permanently. She didn't explain everything. She didn't need to. Her tone said enough. There was something waiting for her back in Australia that she didn't want to face. But life continued. Plans, responsibilities, visas, obligations. She returned to Australia believing she could manage what she had escaped before. She believed she was strong enough. That belief, that strength alone is protection, is one many victims share. And tragically, it's often proven wrong. Tatiana was independent, intelligent, resilient, and none of that saved her from a man who refused to let her go. From the outside, there was nothing about Tatiana Dokhotaru's relationship with Danny Zayat that demanded attention. No police cars parked outside their building. No public confrontations. No dramatic breakups played out on social media. To friends and acquaintances, it looked private, intense perhaps, but not alarming. That is often how the most dangerous relationships exist. Tatiana and Zayat did not share a chaotic on-again, off-again image in public. Their conflict stayed contained. What little people saw appeared manageable, even normal. Arguments happen. Breakups happen. Most people move on. Zayat did not. Behind closed doors, the dynamic was shifting. Text messages later reviewed by investigators showed a pattern that didn't surface immediately. Control masked as concern, jealousy framed as care. Questions about Tatiana's whereabouts turned into accusations. Innocent interactions became imagined betrayals. What made the relationship especially deceptive was its silence. Tatiana did not openly complain. She did not file early reports. She did not seek attention. To those around her, there was no reason to intervene, but silence doesn't mean safety. After Tatiana ended the relationship, Zayat's behavior changed. The break was not mutual in his mind. Messages showed he struggled to accept that it was over, not emotionally, but psychologically. He spoke as if the separation was temporary, as if persistence would restore what he believed belonged to him. Investigators would later describe this as detachment from reality. Zayat monitored Tatiana's life closely after the breakup. He questioned her friendships, interpreted silence as provocation, read independence as rejection. Each step Tatiana took away from him was perceived as a threat, and threats demand response, at least in his mind. What makes this chapter chilling is how unremarkable it appeared to everyone else. No one questioned why he stayed emotionally present after the breakup. No one asked why he still knew her routines. No one challenged his access to her space. Because nothing looked urgent. Tatiana, on the other hand, was slowly retreating. She kept her fears contained. She tried to manage the situation quietly, believing distance would be enough. But distance doesn't work when one person refuses to acknowledge it exists. By the time anyone realized this relationship was dangerous, it already crossed a line that couldn't be undone. And the man no one questioned had become the man no one could stop. Warning signs rarely arrive as clear alarms. They appear slowly, disguised as ordinary relationship problems. Things people are taught to tolerate, excuse, or minimize. In Tatiana Dokhotaru's case, the signs were there. They just didn't look dramatic enough to demand action. After the breakup, Danny Zayat's messages became more frequent, not less. Investigators later reviewed text conversations that showed an unhealthy fixation. He questioned her decisions, her silence, her independence. When she didn't respond, he filled in the gaps himself with suspicion. This wasn't concern. It was surveillance. Zayat framed his behavior as confusion, heartbreak, and frustration. But beneath the words was something more dangerous, a refusal to accept reality. He spoke as if the relationship still existed, as if Tatiana's decision required his approval. That mindset matters. Because when someone believes a relationship hasn't ended, boundaries stop meaning anything. Friends and acquaintances saw none of this. Tatiana did not share screenshots. She did not ask people to intervene. From the outside, the breakup appeared clean, but inside, the pressure was constant. Zayat's jealousy intensified after Tatiana began rebuilding her life. The idea that she might see someone else became an obsession. Investigators later described him as pathologically jealous, not reacting to real threats, but to imagined ones. And jealousy, when paired with entitlement, often becomes violence. Tatiana attempted to disengage. She reduced contact. She drew emotional distance. But she didn't disappear. She didn't vanish. And she didn't believe she needed police intervention, yet that hesitation is common. People fear escalation. They fear being seen as dramatic. They fear consequences they can't control. What no one saw was how Zayat interpreted her restraint. To him, it wasn't caution. It was defiance. By the time Tatiana's family noticed the change in her demeanor during her 2022 visit to Canada, the warning signs were already deep-rooted. She asked if she could stay. She didn't explain fully, but fear doesn't need detail to be real. She went back anyway, not because the danger wasn't real, but because she believed she could manage it. That belief is the final warning sign investigators talk about most quietly. The idea that intelligence, strength, or composure can neutralize obsession. They can't. And when the warning signs were finally impossible to ignore, there was no time left to act. The final hours of Tatiana Dokhotaru's life were not chaotic. They were tense, controlled, and steadily deteriorating. On the night in May 2023, Tatiana was inside her Liverpool apartment, going through what she likely believed would be another uncomfortable encounter, one she could endure, manage, and eventually end. There is no evidence she expected violence when the night began. Danny Zayat arrived without invitation. Investigators later confirmed there was no planned meeting. His presence alone shifted the balance of the evening. This was not a conversation between equals. It was an intrusion. Text exchanges from earlier showed Tatiana trying to create distance. But distance collapses when someone refuses to respect it. Zayat came with unresolved anger, jealousy, and a belief that the situation still belonged to him. At some point during the night, the argument turned toward money. Tatiana kept cash in her apartment, earnings from her business, stored deliberately in a distinctive shoebox. Justice Desmond Fagan would later find that Zayat took tens of thousands of dollars that night. The amount mattered, but the act mattered more. This was not theft by opportunity. It was taking. As the confrontation escalated, Tatiana's control over the situation began to slip. What had once been verbal became physical. Investigators would later determine that she suffered multiple blunt force injuries to the head, injuries that could not be explained by a simple fall. But before the violence reached its peak, Tatiana made a decision. She reached for her phone. That moment tells us something important. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She sought help, calmly, clearly. She understood the danger had crossed a line. She could no longer manage alone. The emergency call captured her state of mind. Not panicked, not hysterical. Focused. My ex is trying to kill me. He's stealing my money. Those words were not emotional. They were factual. 89 seconds into the call, it ended abruptly. Investigators later connected that moment to CCTV footage, showing a flash of light from the apartment balcony. Evidence prosecutors argue with Zayat throwing the phone away. After the call ended, there was no chance for intervention, no witnesses, no alarms, just silence. What happened next inside that apartment would only be reconstructed later, to injuries, timelines, and physical evidence. By the time the night was over, Tatiana was no longer alive, and the man she had feared had already left the scene. The last hours were gone. All that remained were fragments, and the truth waiting to be uncovered. The moment everything changed did not announce itself with noise. There was no sudden break that neighbors could hear. No alarm, no immediate response. It happened quietly, behind a locked door, in the aftermath of a call that should have brought help. After the emergency line went dead, Tatiana Dokhotaru was completely isolated. Investigators later emphasized how critical that moment was. The phone was gone. The connection to the outside world was severed. Whatever happened next would leave no witnesses. Forensic evidence showed that the violence intensified after the call ended. Tatiana suffered at least 3 significant blunt force injuries to the head. These were not minor. They were forceful enough to cause severe trauma. Injuries consistent with punches, being struck with an object, or being pushed violently against a hard surface. This is where the case shifted from confrontation to fatal assault. The prosecution argued that during this attack, or immediately after, Tatiana fell from a height inside the apartment. The jury ultimately accepted that her death resulted from a combination of blunt force trauma and a fall, not one event, but a sequence. That sequence matters because it shows escalation, it shows loss of control, and it shows intent. Instead of stopping, the behavior intensified. After Tatiana was fatally injured, Danny Zayat did not call for help. There was no attempt at resuscitation, no frantic effort to undo what had happened. He left. That decision became one of the most damaging pieces of evidence against him. Hours passed. Tatiana lay alone in the apartment. No ambulance was dispatched. No neighbor was alerted. No authority intervened. Silence filled the space where urgency should have been. When Zayat later returned to the apartment, it was no longer about preventing harm. The harm had already been done. What remained was narrative, what story he would tell, and how he would explain the unexplained. Investigators would later scrutinize every minute after the assault. His movements, his absence, his return. Because in cases like this, the truth often reveals itself not in what a suspect says, but in what they choose not to do. The moment everything changed wasn't when the call ended. It was when he walked away and left Tatiana behind. After violence ended, what followed was not chaos, but absence. The apartment fell quiet. No movement, no call for help, no attempt to undo what had already been done. For hours, Tatiana Dokhotaru lay alone, unseen and unheard, in the place she believed was supposed to keep her safe. Danny Zayat had left the building. Investigators later focused heavily on this period, not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. There was no call to emergency services, no contact with neighbors, no effort to seek medical help. That silence would become as significant as the violence itself. Time passed. Morning came. Life continued outside the apartment. People went to work. Cars moved in and out of the complex. No one knew a crime had already taken place just a few floors above them. Zayat eventually returned to the apartment. The exact timing would later be scrutinized in court, but what mattered more was a sequence. He did not return with help. He did not alert authorities immediately. He re-entered the scene alone. When police were finally contacted, Tatiana was already dead. From the start, Zayat's behavior drew attention. Body-worn camera footage captured him emotional, wailing, struggling to speak. At face value, it looked like grief, but investigators are trained to look beyond displays. They look at timing. They look at consistency. They look at what aligns and what doesn't. Zayat's account raised questions. The injuries on Tatiana's body did not match an accident. The emergency call contradicted any suggestion of self-inflicted harm, and the missing cash could not be ignored. In private conversations, secretly recorded by associates, Zayat floated the idea that Tatiana may have taken her own life. That explanation was inconsistent with the evidence and with the fear captured on her final call. Investigators preserved the apartment as a crime scene. Forensic teams documented injuries, analyzed surfaces, and reconstructed movement. Each detail chipped away at the narrative Zayat appeared to be forming. Silence once again became central. The silence after the call. The silence after the injuries. The silence before authorities were contacted. And in that silence, the evidence spoke clearly. Tatiana did not choose this. She did not fall accidentally. She did not disappear unnoticed. What happened to her was deliberate, and the quiet that followed was not shock. It was abandonment. The case was no longer about what might have happened. It was about proving what did. From the moment investigators began questioning Danny Zayat, one thing became clear. His version of events did not align with reality. At first, his explanations were vague, emotional, unstructured. He spoke in fragments, circling around the timeline instead of walking through it. Investigators noted this immediately. People who experience genuine shock tend to cling to facts. Zayat avoided them. He suggested confusion. He implied accidents. In private conversations later uncovered, he went further, floating the idea that Tatiana may have taken her own life. That suggestion collapsed under scrutiny. The emergency call alone dismantled it. Tatiana's voice was coherent, alert, and focused on immediate threat. She didn't describe despair. She described danger. She identified the person responsible. Investigators then turned to the physical evidence. Tatiana had suffered multiple blunt force injuries to the head. These were not consistent with a single fall. They indicated repeated impact, force applied intentionally. The injuries told a story of escalation, not accident. Then there was a phone. CCTV footage captured a flash of light from the apartment balcony around the time the emergency call ended. Prosecutors argued this was the moment the phone was thrown, explaining why the call abruptly cut off. Zayat could not account for this. And then there was the money, tens of thousands of dollars in cash, stored in a distinctive shoebox, were missing. Zayat initially downplayed this detail, but financial motive cannot be ignored when it coincides with violence. Investigators reconstructed the timeline minute by minute. They mapped Zayat's movements, compared them against call logs, CCTV footage, and forensic findings. The story implied that Tatiana somehow caused her own death, required too many impossible coincidences, injuries that appeared without cause, a phone that disappeared on its own, money that vanished without explanation. Reality was simpler and far darker. Zayat's behavior after the incident also contradicted his narrative. He left the apartment. He did not seek help. He did not return with urgency. Those choices mattered, because innocent people behave differently. As the investigation progressed, his story became less important than the evidence. Investigators no longer asked what he claimed happened. They asked what could not have happened. And one by one, the answers eliminated every version except one. The story didn't make sense because it wasn't true. And by the time prosecutors were finished, there was nowhere left for the truth to hide. When authorities finally entered Tatiana Dokhotaru's apartment, the scene was quiet, almost ordinary, but evidence quickly revealed the extraordinary cruelty that had occurred. Investigators methodically documented everything, knowing that each detail could reconstruct the final hours of her life. Forensic analysis confirmed blunt force trauma to her head. 3 significant injuries, each severe enough to be fatal alone, but collectively ensuring her death. These were not accidents, nor could they have been caused by a single fall. The pattern indicated intentional, repeated violence. Investigators concluded that the blows were inflicted either with fists, objects, or by forcefully pushing her against hard surfaces. Every angle told the same story. Deliberate harm. Then there was a phone. Emergency call records showed Tatiana had contacted 000-000, pleading for help. Her final words were concise and factual. "My ex is trying to kill me. He's stealing my money." Only 89 seconds passed before the line went dead. Investigators later tied CCTV footage from outside the apartment to that exact moment. A flash of light from the balcony, consistent with Zayat throwing her phone. That single act severed her lifeline, leaving her completely vulnerable. Financial evidence also became pivotal. Tatiana had kept tens of thousands of dollars in a distinctive shoebox, proceeds from a small business selling imitation luxury goods. The money was gone when the police arrived. Investigators determined Zayat had taken it, providing both motive and a clear sequence of premeditated actions. Text messages between Tatiana and Zayat were also scrutinized. They revealed his obsession, detachment from reality, and relentless control. Threats, accusations, and evidence of past abuse painted a picture of a man unwilling to accept the end of a relationship, fixated on regaining control, and escalating to lethal violence. Investigators also examined Zayat's behavior post-incident. Body cam footage captured him wailing to police, a performance inconsistent with the deliberate, controlled actions inside the apartment. Secretly recorded conversations showed him suggesting Tatiana may have taken her own life, an explanation directly contradicted by physical evidence and the content of her final call. By the time investigators pieced it all together, the narrative was clear. Tatiana had fought, she had called for help, and she had been silenced. The evidence didn't just tell her story, it demanded justice. Tatiana Dokhotaru's tragic death was not an isolated incident. It was a culmination of a documented pattern of abuse that unfolded over months, even years. Investigators and prosecutors spent significant time establishing this pattern, because understanding it was key to understanding both motive and intent. Text messages, phone records, and witness statements painted a chilling picture. Danny Zayat was not merely jealous, he was pathologically jealous. He monitored Tatiana's interactions, questioned her friends, and interpreted normal, everyday activities as threats to his control. Each confrontation, while subtle to outsiders, eroded her autonomy and created a psychological environment of fear. Investigators described his behavior as detachment from reality, an obsession that left him incapable of accepting the end of the relationship. The abuse followed a predictable cycle. Verbal attacks escalated to physical intimidation. Threats were often paired with apologies or explanations designed to normalize the behavior. Tatiana's attempts to disengage only fueled a fixation. By the night, she called emergency services. This pattern had escalated to lethal violence. Financial control was another element of the abuse. Tatiana had earned tens of thousands of dollars through her business, money she kept in a shoebox. Zayat demanded access and ultimately took it during a confrontation that would end her life. Investigators interpreted this not simply as theft, but as an extension of the controlling behavior that had marked their relationship from the start. Possession and dominance were intertwined in his mind. Prosecutors argued and the jury agreed that this was not a moment of uncontrolled rage. It was a predictable outcome of a cycle of manipulation, intimidation, and obsessive control. By mapping the incidents of verbal, emotional, and physical abuse, investigators demonstrated how each act built upon the previous one, culminating in a calculated act of lethal violence. The pattern was clear. Zayat's obsession grew as Tatiana attempted to separate herself from him. Each attempt at independence triggered escalation. Each boundary she tried to assert was met with aggression. And in the end, the violence that had been mounted behind closed doors claimed her life. Understanding the pattern is essential. It reframes Tatiana's death not as an isolated tragedy, but as a inevitable conclusion of a documented, ongoing cycle of abuse. One that, if recognized earlier, might have been interrupted. The arrest of Danny Zayat was not a sudden moment of discovery. It was a result of meticulous police work, careful reconstruction of events, and a growing body of evidence that left investigators with little room for doubt. Authorities arrived at Zayat's apartment shortly after Tatiana's death had been confirmed. For hours, forensic teams had documented the scene. Injuries, missing items, and the abrupt ending of Tatiana's emergency call painted a clear picture of a violent confrontation. Combined with CCTV footage and witness accounts, the investigation left a single focus: Zayat. Police approached the arrest with caution. They knew the profile of the suspect. Zayat had shown patterns of obsession and control, behavior that suggested he could respond unpredictably. Officers prepared for resistance. But when Zayat was confronted, he did not resist physically. Instead, he exhibited emotional theatrics, wailing, pleading, and attempting to shape the narrative. Investigators quickly noted discrepancies in his statements. The story he offered on the night of the arrest conflicted with forensic evidence. Injuries did not match his version of events. Missing money contradicted his claims. An emergency call, corroborated by phone logs and CCTV, directly undermined his explanations. Every lie unraveled under scrutiny. Within hours, Zayat was formally charged with murder. Prosecutors emphasized premeditation and the pattern of abuse leading up to Tatiana's death. They highlighted the theft of cash, the severed emergency call, and the multiple blunt force injuries, arguing that these were not random acts, but deliberate actions consistent with man obsessed with control and unable to accept the end of a relationship. The arrest itself was just the beginning of the legal process, but it marked a pivotal turning point. For Tatiana's family, it brought a sense of relief that justice had a chance to be served, though it could never undo the tragedy. By the time Zayat was in custody, investigators had already begun piecing together a full timeline. His movements that night, the escalation of the confrontation, the theft of cash, and the deliberate silencing of Tatiana's last call for help. Each element of the case strengthened the evidence, ensuring that the arrest was not only necessary but inevitable. The arrest was more than a procedural step. It was a confirmation. The man who had terrorized and ultimately killed Tatiana Dokhotaru would face the full weight of the law. Tatiana Dokhotaru's final minutes were not chaotic. They were calculated, deliberate, and filled with courage, qualities that tragically weren't enough to save her. After the confrontation with Danny Zayat escalated, Tatiana made a critical decision. She called 000000. Her voice was calm, precise, and controlled. "My ex is trying to kill me. He's stealing my money," she told the operator. There was no panic, no hesitation, just facts. In those words, investigators later noted, she demonstrated both awareness of the danger and a clear attempt to protect herself. That call lasted 89 seconds. Then, abruptly, it ended. CCTV footage captured a flash of light from the apartment balcony. The moment Zayat threw her phone, severing her final connection to the outside world. That act transformed a desperate plea into a silent, powerless situation. From that instant, she was entirely isolated. Investigators reconstructed her movements during those last minutes. The injuries she suffered, 3 significant blows to the head, were not accidental. They were inflicted in rapid succession, each one increasing in severity. The forensic team concluded that the force and placement of the injury suggested intent, either by striking with fists or objects or pushing her against hard surfaces. Combined with evidence of a fall, these injuries were fatal. During these final minutes, Zayat had full control over the environment. He dictated the outcome. He decided that Tatiana would not leave the apartment alive. There was no intervention, no pause, no reconsideration. The silence that followed the call was a testament not to shock, but to deliberate action. Tatiana's courage in those moments illuminates the danger of domestic violence in ways that are easy to overlook. Victims often understand the risk and take steps to protect themselves. Yet, when faced with someone intent on control and obsession, those precautions can fail. By the time authorities arrived, Tatiana's last minutes had passed, but investigators were able to piece together the sequence through phone records, CCTV footage, forensic evidence, and text messages. Every detail confirmed what she had known in her final seconds, that she was facing a man who would not stop until he had taken everything from her, even her life. Her last minutes tell a story of bravery and terror intertwined, a measured, desperate attempt to survive against overwhelming, calculated violence. The trial of Danny Zayat was a meticulous examination of evidence, behavior, and motive. For weeks, the courtroom replayed the final hours of Tatiana Dokhotaru's life through phone records, CCTV footage, forensic reports, and text messages. Every detail, no matter how small, was dissected to reveal the truth behind her death. By the time the jury retired to deliberate, the pattern was clear. Tatiana's injuries were consistent with repeated, deliberate blows to the head. The fall she suffered was not accidental. It was part of a violent sequence. Her emergency call had been cut short, the phone removed from her reach, and tens of thousands of dollars she had earned were missing, stolen during the confrontation. Every piece of evidence pointed to intentional action. The prosecution painted a portrait of a man consumed by obsession and control. Text messages revealed Zayat's jealousy, his refusal to accept the end of the relationship, and his fixation on preventing Tatiana from moving on. Witnesses testified to previous incidents of verbal and emotional abuse, showing a pattern that escalated over time. Zayat's defense tried to cast doubt on the sequence of events. They suggested accidents, confusion, and misinterpretation. But the jury found these arguments unconvincing. The forensic evidence, combined with Tatiana's emergency call and the timeline established by investigators, left little room for alternative explanations. After careful deliberation, the jury returned a verdict, guilty of murder. The 11 jurors agreed, one dissented. Justice Desmond Fagan emphasized the calculated nature of Zayed's actions, describing him as pathologically jealous and fixated on control. The court recognized that this was not a moment of unthinking rage, but the inevitable outcome of a pattern of abuse that had been allowed to escalate. Sentencing followed swiftly. Zayed received 24 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 18 years. Justice Fagan spoke directly to the broader societal implications, stressing the importance of recognizing early signs of danger and the role law enforcement intervention can play in preventing tragedy. The courtroom fell silent as the sentence was read. For Tatiana's family, it was a small measure closure in the face of irreparable loss. For the public, it was a stark reminder: obsession and control, left unchecked, can become lethal. The verdict was final. Zayed would spend decades behind bars, but the memory of Tatiana's life and her courage in the last minutes remains. Her story, painstakingly reconstructed by investigators, now serves as both warning and testament to the destructive power of domestic abuse. The murder of Tatiana Dokhotaru is not just another tragic headline. It is a case that forces us to confront the quiet, insidious nature of domestic violence. It matters because it reveals how obsession, control, and abuse can escalate in ways that are almost invisible to outsiders, yet fatal to those trapped within. Tatiana's story is one of courage. She left a controlling relationship. She sought independence. She tried to protect herself. She called emergency services in the moments she understood her life was at risk. And yet, her precautions were not enough. That is a reality this case lays bare. Intelligence, planning, and strength alone cannot always overcome someone determined to inflict harm. The case also underscores the importance of early action by law enforcement and support networks. Justice Fagan highlighted that repeated interventions or restraining orders can sometimes deter escalation, but nothing is foolproof. This is a sobering reminder that society must take threats seriously, even when they appear minor. Education, awareness, and rapid response can save lives. Moreover, Tatiana's case demonstrates the critical role of meticulous investigation. Forensic evidence, digital communication records, CCTV footage, and witness statements collectively reveal the truth when lies and manipulations were presented. Without this attention to detail, the narrative could have been distorted and accountability lost. Finally, this case matters because it humanizes the statistics. Tatiana was more than a victim. She was a person with ambition, courage, and a life cut tragically short. Her story emphasizes the stakes behind the abstract numbers about domestic violence. Every statistic represents someone's last moments, often spent trying to survive against calculated harm. Her death leaves a legacy that demands attention. It calls for awareness of the warning signs, recognition of obsession disguised as affection, and unwavering support for those who seek help. It reminds us that domestic violence is rarely sudden. It is a predictable, escalating threat that can end in tragedy if ignored. Tatiana Dokhotaru's story matters because it is a warning, a lesson, and a call to action. And while justice was served in court, the real impact lies in how our life and our courage can prevent future tragedies.